Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For today's true crime narration, we shall be visiting Australia to look at the case of James Smith, who was often known as Jockey. James Edward Smith was born on the 3rd of October 1942. He was the second of 8 children born to Daniel and Jean Smith in Colac, Victoria. The family lived in a rural area where James discovered his love of horses. He had a happy upbringing despite the fact that money was scarce. His parents were well known within the local area for their charity and community work. James left school in 1956 when he was 14 years old. He soon became an apprentice to a local horse trainer in Caulfield. James was approximately 168 centimetres tall, which was at the top end of height for a professional jockey. He also soon struggled to maintain the required horse racing weight, and as such opportunities to race were scarce. He continued to love all aspects of horse racing, particularly the gambling. In order to fund his betting on the horses, he turned to stealing, and by the time he was 18 years old had received his first prison sentence. It was in prison that he received his nickname of Jockey, despite the fact that any hope of a racing career was now over. During his stint in prison, he befriended a man by the name of Ronald Ryan. Ronald was 17 years older than James and became somewhat of a mentor to him during this time. Throughout the 1960s, James spent more time in prison than out of it. He chalked up convictions for robbing banks, drug distribution, theft, armed robbery, breaking and entering, and the possession of firearms. It is believed that some of these crimes may have been committed with the help of Ronald, who also spent a significant amount of time in and out of prison in the 1960s. James was known to have a short temper and would quickly escalate to violence whenever he was confronted. In the early 1970s, James continued to commit armed robberies. On 2 separate occasions, once during a shop robbery and once during a police search of his car, James fired at police officers at close range. On both of these occasions, his gun jammed and the police officers were fortunately unharmed. Following the incident where he pulled the gun on the police officer searching his car, James fled to Sydney but was soon arrested. He was charged with a series of armed robberies but was released on bail. In October 1974, he disappeared. An extensive police search followed, and on 2nd of December 1974, James was arrested whilst relaxing on a public beach in Melbourne. He was taken to Pentridge Prison on remand whilst awaiting extradition back to New South Wales. The remand prisoners remained in their civilian clothing rather than having to wear prison scrubs. Using this to his advantage, James managed to jump a fence, steal a visitor's pass, and simply walk out of the prison gates. He had been at the high security prison for less than 2 days. After his escape, James reinvented himself using the pseudonym Tommy Cummings. This was derived from 2 of his favourite horse trainers, Tommy Smith and Bart Cummings. Living in and around the Nowra and Kangaroo Valley areas in New South Wales, he made a new life as a rural horse trainer. He lived with and later married a lady by the name of Valerie Hill and lived a quiet and discreet life with her and her daughter. James had some success with his horses at country race meetings and even ventured out to Sydney to enter a race. However, it wasn't long before his old life drew him back in. It would seem that he was addicted to the thrill of the crime. In 1976, during a burglary, he was interrupted by a police officer. His short temper and reliance on violence once again came to the fore, and he shot Constable Jerry Andrews before making his escape. Thankfully, the policeman survived. The following year, James and 2 associates planned a burglary at the home of a bookmaker by the name of Lloyd Tidmarsh. On the evening of the 13th of June 1977, the 3 men broke into Lloyd's home where Lloyd, his wife, and 2 children were sleeping. During the course of the burglary, Lloyd was shot and killed. Further bank robberies and burglaries followed, including one in early September 1977, where a robber escaped with approximately 180,000 Australian dollars, for which James was the main suspect. At the time, this was the largest bank hold-up in Australia's history. Eventually, following a tip-off by a local estate agent, the police tracked James to a farmhouse in McMahon Road in North Nowra. In the early hours of the morning of 14th of September 1977, the police were preparing to ambush the farmhouse when the neighbour's dog started barking and gave them away. This small window of opportunity allowed James to escape into nearby woodland. The farmhouse was searched and multiple weapons, police radios and disguises were found. Valerie was arrested. After various sightings, James was found shortly afterwards hiding in a telephone box on Maru Street, Bomaderry, about 3 miles away from the farmhouse. A violent struggle between James and Detective Bob Godden followed. James pulled out his gun and the detective managed to jam his thumb behind the trigger in order to prevent James from being able to shoot him. This version of events has been discredited by some, as they believe that this method of preventing the gun firing would be physically impossible. James had made many enemies in the police force over the years, and the question was raised whether he had in fact been the victim of a police setup. At trial, James received a life sentence for the murder of Lloyd Tidmarsh, primarily based on the testimony of Lloyd's daughter, Michelle, who identified James as the shooter by his distinctive voice. He received an additional life sentence for shooting Constable Jerry Ambrose in 1976 and a further life sentence for the attempted murder of Detective Bob Godden in the telephone box. All of his convictions were appealed, and the life sentence for Lloyd's murder was dismissed after the testimony of Lloyd's daughter was overturned. In addition, he was successful in his appeal for the shooting of Jerry Ambrose, with his counsel making allegations of police fabricating confessions. James was also able to get his sentence for the attempted murder of Detective Bob Godden reduced from life to 14 years. In 1992, James was released on parole, having spent around 25 of the previous 30 years incarcerated. James went to stay with his wife Valerie, who now lived in an apartment near Bondi Beach. Shortly after James' release, he and Valerie were returning home to her apartment one evening when they were confronted by a gunman in the stairwell of the apartment block. James was shot at close range in the chest, stomach and leg. Despite being severely injured, he survived. He also refused to cooperate with the police, and the gunman was never found. After about a month, James discharged himself from hospital and relocated to an area called Terrigal, about an hour north of Sydney. He then started to make a significant income by distributing illegal drugs. Despite being financially secure, James would always prefer to steal than pay wherever possible. On 29th of November 1992, he visited the Arena Fair shopping centre where he was caught shoplifting by a security guard. As he was being escorted to the security office, he threatened the guard with a gun before escaping into the car park. Here, he came upon an elderly couple in their car and he jumped into the back seat, shouting at them to drive away. After a short while, he then switched to a second stolen car and then left town on an overnight train to Melbourne. A week later, on 5th of December 1992, a 31-year-old police constable by the name of Ian Harris saw a white Ford panel van driving suspiciously slowly on the Midland Highway near Daylesford. Acting on instinct, Ian checked the licence plate and found that the vehicle had been reported as being stolen from the North Kit railway station in Melbourne the day before. Ian followed the van until it stopped outside the Farmers Arms Hotel at Creswick. Ian was talking on the radio when the driver of the van approached him in his police car. After a short conversation, Ian asked the driver to provide his ID and proof of ownership. The driver, James, walked back to his van and retrieved the vehicle documents from the glove box. Inside the document folder, he had concealed his gun. As James walked back towards the police car, Ian was standing next to the driver's door. James pulled the gun out from the papers and demanded that Ian hand over his weapon. Ian immediately put his hands in the air but did not hand over his gun. James, losing his temper, fired a bullet into the ground, again demanding that Ian gave him his weapon. The noise of the shot attracted the attention of the people in the nearby pub, who called the authorities. At the same time, a passing motorist, Darren Neal, saw what was happening. With confident and quick reactions, Darren drove his car directly at James. This gave Ian the small window of opportunity which he needed in order to grab his gun. Ian fired 3 shots at James, hitting him in the chest and stomach. James died instantly. Despite James' notoriety and having been branded as public enemy number 1 in 2 Australian states, Ian was completely unaware of James's identity until police assistance arrived after the shooting. James' funeral was held on the 11th of December 1992 and was attended by over 60 people, many of whom believed that he had been unjustly treated at the hands of the authorities over the years. Both Ian and Darren found the events of that night extremely difficult to come to terms with. They were both subsequently presented with awards for their courage and bravery. That concludes our story today on James Jockey Smith. Please add any comments down below on this case. As always, I look forward to reading them. And now it's time for petty crime. First up, we have Lexi and Leisha. Their owner is Preska from BC. I didn't know Briefcase had his own province these days, but well done, BC. Each video, Preska has been skipping forward to check petty crime each week. Let me tell you about Lexi and Leisha, Leshia. They are sisters and they both love to chase bugs, which is their real passion. They are both 4 years old. Leisha is more quiet and ladylike, but Lexi is more of the tomboy. Lexi loves attention as much as she loves snacks, and she has to start every day with a proper petting and cuddle section with Preska's mom. Thanks for sending them in, Preska, and thanks for being so patient. And next up, we have some pictures that have been sent in by Rose Waters, who was one of our earliest subscribers here at the Crime Reel. Rose was introduced to true crime by her mum, Laura Lee. Laura Lee was a professional breeder who showed Chinese Shar-Peis. However, she never made a great deal from breeding, as she always became far too attached to the puppies to give them up. She only ever managed to part with one of them, and after doing so, still went to visit it every month. So Rose grew up in a house full of dogs, 16 to be exact, 12 Shar-Peis, a Beagle, a Border Collie and 2 Dachshunds. These dogs all lived well beyond their expected lifespans in a home full of love. Those of you that may have read some of Rose's comments on this channel will know that sadly Laura Lee is no longer with us. Tuesday will mark the 18th anniversary of Rose losing her mum, so our thoughts and love go out to her at this difficult time. Thanks for sending the pictures in, Rose, and hello to Mark, Grenadine, Arlo and Momo as well. Thanks very much for listening to the Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. The one bit of information I didn't give you when I told you about Ronald Ryan, the mentor from the prison, is that Ronald would later become well known as he was the last man to be hanged in Australia. Goodbye.